It's a very exciting week, especially for Trade Nerd Ian, because our special guest is Dmitry Grozoubinski, former Australian trade negotiator at the WTO and founder of explaintrade.com, which does what it says on the tin. It explains negotiations and trade policy. Liam Fox, please add to your bookmarks. Dmitry is the man who told Marshall Plan fantasist Daniel Korczynski MP that the EU is being very ungrateful, given the UK defeated the Nazis at Stalingrad, the Persians at Thermopylae and Saruman at Hell's Deep. Hello, Dmitry, and welcome to Remainiacs. We don't hear much about trade anymore from the Brexiters, do we? Why is that?
So, I mean, this is the thing. You do and you don't. So what this effect drives me mental. So at some point I will begin melting this microphone with sheer frustration. But what you get is, they will talk about trade right up until the minute you push back in a way that they can't talk around by just blasting out vague platitudes or scientific terms. At that point, they will take half a step back and say, listen, the referendum wasn't about trade, which, look, I mean, people voted leave and remain for all sorts of different things. I've been very clear since I got into this hellscape that I never pass judgment on anything outside of my lane. I'm not a UK citizen, not even an EU citizen. I'm not an EU resident. I'm essentially an alien sent from Alpha Centauri to be baffled by your political process. And so they kind that is kind of fair enough, but it always begs the question, if it's not about trade, why are you constantly on TV lying about the trade elements of this? And again, without wading into the politics, it wasn't a 90-10 referendum where you could go, yeah, okay, some wild promises were made about economics, but, you know, it was such an... It was so close that to have people turn around and go, well, if we've been honest about the fact that from a trade perspective, this is 100% downsides and has no upsides of any kind except ones we've imagined, and it'll be hugely disruptive, the idea that that couldn't possibly have swayed enough people and therefore justifies like that lying doesn't matter is insufferable. But to answer your question directly, the reason you don't hear about it is that they've gotten to this point where the fact that the referendum happened now justifies the referendum. We no longer even discuss whether Brexit is objectively a good idea. That's not on the Brexit Party's platform. Well, they don't have one, but if they did, it doesn't appear to be on it. What's on it is there was a referendum, we have to honor the vote of the people. And so the trade elements, the national security elements, the geopolitical elements, none of that matters anymore to them, to the kind of dichotomy they're placing, because what they're trying to put front and center is people voted, do you honor that or not? And so that's why you don't hear about trade. Plus, we keep making fun of them.
You've just published a very handy guide for journalists on how to interview people about trade. We will share it on social media. And in the introduction, you say, the field is packed with very confident but utterly clueless chancers who prey on the technical nature of the subject matter to spout utter nonsense, laden with enough impressive-sounding terminology to appear credible. Did you have anybody in mind?
Did I have anybody not in mind? I mean, this is kind of the whole Brexit trade debate in a nutshell, isn't it? Where it's inevitably somebody out there talking about Article 24 of the GATT and an interviewer sitting in front of them going, well, God, I've read that that's not right, but I mean, I don't know the 1947 GATT down to the sub-paragraph, and I don't want to look silly or biased by challenging this person and getting dunked live on air. So I'm just going to furrow my brow and nod thoughtfully while looking the slightest bit dubious to give me cover on the YouTube video and then move right past it. I mean, you see it over and over again. I was in an interview with the leading intellectual of the pro-Brexit trade movement, Shankar Singham, we were being interviewed. And
we love him here.
He's apparently a very personable man. He's never been anything but lovely to me. But he was out there and he was asked a question, a very direct question about what cutting tariffs to zero on textiles would do to a very specific industry that the Channel 4, I think it was, had run a kind of segment on before. And he pivots to talking about trade defense and anti-dumping measures, and he strings kind of these syllables together, and it's all I mean, what he was saying was broadly factually correct. It had nothing to do with the question, but it allows them to diffuse this question into the ether of, well, all that sounds hard, and economists disagree about it. Let's just move right along.
What do you think would happen in the event of a no deal?
Look, I mean, obviously your GDP would increase by about 12% instantly. I've got a Patrick Minford article about it, and he seems very confident. No, I think, let's focus on the negotiations with the EU, because I think that's a really important question. Right now, the biggest advantage the UK actually has in negotiations with the EU is that the EU has a preference for a smooth off-ramp. The UK and EU are traveling on a bus on a highway. The UK has decided to get off this highway, and the EU wants to minimize the disruption to themselves and their businesses when that happens. And so there is an inclination, anything that they're negotiating is detracting from a status quo. There is a way things work now. There is a way things will work in the future. That way will be more limited. And so you're kind of pulling away from something that exists. Once you go over the cliff edge and the EU is under trade law, and just what they will do is revert you back to WTO rules and take away that status quo, the negotiations begin not from a place of where you guys are today, but where you will be on that day, which is bloody nowhere. So there's all of these assumptions of we'll do this FTA and of course we'll get complete tariff-free access. If I'm an EU negotiator and I'm sitting across that table, I'm going, why? It's one thing to continue existing arrangements and roll them smoothly from one thing to another, nothing's changed. But if you yank that steering wheel left, crash off the little railing on the highway, and go plummeting into the undergrowth, the idea that they will just begin negotiations as if you're still cruising along by their side is very optimistic.
To say the least.
So, people keep inviting me for meetings and they leave more depressed than when they sat down. I swear I'm a fun person. Everyone in the room just laughed, for the listeners at home. And a single tear is rolling slowly down my cheek. But as to what will happen in no deal, I think if you look at Theresa May's plot armor, and it's very hard to describe, if she was a character on Game of Thrones and had survived as many travails as she had, you'd be like, they're really moving away from George R. Martin's you sneeze and you get shot in the head kind of ethos. But her armor this whole time is that none of these people, especially in the ERG, but including Boris Johnson, who's somewhere in the middle, wants to be driving this bus during a no deal. Nobody wants to be responsible for Brexit Day, because it'll either be not as good as they promised or really, really bad. And like Ian said, Ian's right to say, it could be 50-50 chance on any given day. At some point that runs out. And at some point one of them goes, you know what? I'm going to roll the dice on this and hope I've built up enough reasons to blame her that I can survive being the one at the wheel.
This week's special guest is Dmitry Grozoubinski, former Australian trade negotiator and a man who has met those phantom WTO bosses that we hear so much about. WTO bosses don't actually exist, though, do they?
Well, the WTO has a director general and some deputy director generals, but they're not in charge of the rules. They're in charge of the institution. They're in charge of the secretariat. And they're certainly not in the business of expressing opinions on legal matters of kind of domestic substance inside the UK. That's actually the last thing from their minds.
Well, what is the current state of the WTO that we will be relying on when we go for no deal? Has Donald Trump succeeded in depowering it, or is it still a fairly influential world organization?
I think it's certainly an influential organization in what it's actually for, which is to maintain the status quo of the agreed rules. While the Trump administration has started diverging from them more and more, they are at least trying to rely on the rules of the organization itself, even where they are twisting them in order to do so. They're not just kind of saying up yours and going their own way. They are using legal loopholes and dubious national security findings to say, look, yes, we're diverging from the spirit of the rules and the letter of the rules, and some would say the rules, but we are doing so in a way that is at least consistent with our legal obligations. So from that effect, I mean, is the UK joining an organization, the absolute fundamentals of which is to lock in tariffs at broadly agreed levels to keep trade completely falling apart? No. Is that going to be a really sharp drop from the world's most integrated regional trade agreement? Yes.
A huge part of the Brexit problem in Britain is that we put complex trade issues in front of an audience of ordinary voters who couldn't be expected to understand them, but now insist that they did understand them. Is there a concise way to sum up what Brexit would mean for British trade that listeners can use in the pub or over Sunday lunch with their parents? One that doesn't rely on saying, you don't understand this.
No, and I don't think people should be throwing "you don't understand this" in anybody's face. There's frankly no reason people should understand this. It's incredibly complicated. The way I tend to fall back on describing it is that picture you are trying to sell insurance or even sell a pie to someone in Venezuela from London. Imagine the paperwork requirement, imagine the costs, imagine the logistics, imagine all of the bureaucracy around that and how hard that is to navigate. The EU project, from a trade perspective, has been to chip away at that nightmare over the course of many years until it is as easy to sell all products and many, many services, far more than any free trade agreement has ever done, to somebody in Paris or Lisbon from London. Leaving the EU reverts back. It might not revert all the way back to Venezuela if you guys can avoid no deal, though frankly the way you're going, buy canned goods. But whatever it is, it'll fall significantly short of that. And for the UK, that's especially problematic for two reasons. So many of your businesses rely on their business models for this integration into Europe. If you go back and look at the way the UK was promoting itself as a business center like a week ago, you look at every page of the brochure and it's like, we speak English, we have a legal system that kind of makes sense, our government's pro-business, before we let Boris Johnson in front of a microphone, and we are integrated into Europe on every single page. We are your doorway into Europe. We are your beachhead into Europe, Europe. And you're dismantling that. And that's a huge problem. And your second problem is that you're a services economy. And you're increasingly a services economy. You might be the first major economy on earth for whom services as an export become larger than goods among like major industrialized economies. That's crazy, and that's really problematic because free trade agreements and services are garbage. You never get any access. The four freedoms are so ridiculously unique and incredible to have been achieved. And everything else is so far short of that you're going to do yourselves real damage to really the heart of your future prosperity. So no, there's no way to explain it.
Just do a deal with China and Australia and India, right?
Yeah.
That'll be easy.
Can we talk about Article 24? Just very briefly, because this magical article,
Yes.
this magical article of the WTO rules, it's suddenly back on the agenda thanks to the Brexit Party. We've mentioned this before, but can you remind our listeners what it is and why it's nonsense? Because they keep on talking about it.
Sure. So Article 24 of the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade, GATT to us trade nerds. You can't see it, but I'm flashing gang signs at Ian, and he's responding. We're having a moment. He's actually going to start crip walking up and down there. Is the part of trade law that lets you have free trade agreements and customs unions. Ordinarily, the whole point of the WTO was that you treat everyone the same. You treat every country's goods the same way as you do every other country. But Article 24 allows you to have kind of exceptions to that if you have a full and comprehensive free trade agreement, like a serious one. The reason Brexiteers keep bringing it up is there is a provision in there that says, look, if you're on your way to a free trade agreement, like you're most of the way done, you know what it's going to look like, but you're not quite ready to implement it yet, you can come to the WTO membership and say, look, here is the free trade agreement I'm going to have. Here's my schedule for implementing it. I would like to put it into place, bits of it now. So, for example, a lot of the tariff reductions now, and then we will tell you about our full free trade agreement when it's done. So they have somehow transposed that into, if the UK and EU have no deal, then depending on your level of crazy as a kind of hard right Brexiteer, that either means the UK can invoke this magical article like a scroll of compel person to force the EU not to charge tariffs on UK goods, or it means that somehow the EU will do what it has constantly and repeatedly said it won't do, which is to then go, okay, well, in that case, we instantly put in place an interim trade agreement that eliminates all tariffs. I mean, it's stupid because firstly, the EU is not going to do it. And secondly, as trade nerds have tried to explain for now 2 years across every single medium except interpretive dance, because trust me, you don't want to see that.
We do.
The tariffs are not, like, of all of your problems stemming from Brexit, and Lord knows there are a few. Many of them are on my website. The tariffs are a part of it, but in fact, they're just one component that happens to hit some industries harder than others. The paperwork, the loss of services access, all of these other things are huge, and Article 24 doesn't cover them, and it can't cover them.
So we're a services-based economy, and that's going to make things difficult under WTO rules. So what would our economy have to look like to prosper under WTO rules? How would our industrial base have to change?
It's so in the scenario where you have WTO, you reverted back to WTO rules with Europe.
Yeah, no deal heaven.
No deal happened, and let's kind of ignore the first, say, however long it takes to, like, you know, the water stops running because it turns out that the filtration liquid required is made in a factory in Portugal, and it's stuck in a queue in Calais that runs for 16 miles. Let's kind of set that nightmare aside and say it's 3 years from now, you got an economy. Ideally, what you would want to do is then try to rebuild as much of what you have in the EU as possible, and try to create an industrial base where it still makes sense if you are assembling a complex piece of machinery, like, say, medical equipment, and you want to source a bit of it from Germany and a bit of it from Portugal, and then, say, assemble the whole thing in the UK. You want to create conditions where you can do that. That's going to be really hard because, firstly, the EU's always going to have more frictionless trade internally than it will with a free trade agreement or a customs union partner. And secondly, they frankly don't have a lot of incentive to help you. No. The second thing you want to do is, look, London's always going to be a financial hub. It's always going to be a big center for financial services, legal services. The EU has every incentive to start bleeding off some of that into its own centers by making it incrementally more difficult for you to provide those services into Europe, to insure things in Europe, to provide banking services into Europe, what have you, legal services into Europe. But London, as a huge financial sector, can still thrive just to a lesser extent by continuing to offer those services to those who want to trade into the UK, which is a big economy, but also to the rest of the world. So it's not. This is Remainiacs. So I know I'm supposed to pretend that the island will sink into the sea. In a way, it's a problem with the debate that we've gotten there, that we're talking about the island sinking into the sea. The issue is this is going to make things worse for the UK on every single trade measure. You can still prosper, like your economy will still grow, just more slowly and with a huge amount of disruption for ordinary people who frankly don't deserve it.
Speaking of problems with the economy, British Steel went into liquidation today, partly because of a slump in orders from the EU. And Nigel Farage immediately claimed that the EU emissions trading scheme was to blame, and Britain could bail out the company anyway if it weren't for EU state aid rules. I don't think that's quite true, but you can tell. Is there anything at all in that argument?
I'm not an expert on British Steel or the EU emissions trading scheme.
That's right, neither is he.
Yeah. What I would say is whether you're in the EU or not, the EU has an emissions trading scheme. And if that determined what depreciated their demand for steel, I mean, this is the whole issue behind Brexit, right? Whereas if you find EU regulations annoying, then post-Brexit, you will still have to deal with them because you're in the heart of Europe, and Europe is the center of gravity of this continent and this region. But now you will no longer be in the room to veto the most kind of out there demands of the EU. So if his point is, yeah, the emissions trading scheme killed British steel, well, I don't necessarily buy that. But now the next EU emissions trading scheme, UK Steel's representatives won't even be in the room to say, hey guys, do you want to maybe think about what this is going to do to our community? Is there a way we can shape this that gives us a smoother on-ramp? What are you talking about state aid rules? I mean, he's just making that up, as far as I can tell.
Yeah, I think that's the case. Because plenty of European countries protect their companies or companies they want to protect in that way. How likely do you think the no deal is right now? And sort of can you give it a percentage? Would you like to do that, or would you?
Oh, God, I'm not in the predictions business. I've been getting everything wrong. You want to run directly away from my instinct. My concern is always, I think there's a low chance it happens on purpose, but a worryingly high chance it happens by accident. Or it happens not as a hybrid of the two, where, for example, you could imagine a scenario where a future prime minister wants to have no deal or is okay with having no deal, but doesn't want to be the one to push the button. So what they do, to pick a name, let's just call him B. Johnson, or if that's too obvious, Boris J. What they could do is, for example, when it comes to October, and where the UK is inevitably asking for another extension, he could just make utterly unrealistic demands. He could, say, condition it on the EU dropping the backstop or something. The EU internally balks at that request, says no, and he can turn around to the public and say, look, I didn't want no deal, I was prepared to negotiate, but the EU didn't want to come to the table. That is my current nightmare scenario, where it kind of happens without it being anybody's stated objective. By, as David Allen Green would say, by automatic application of law. Well,
Dmitry, what's the most important aspect of the trade issue that people should take away?
Shit's hard, yo. When you guys do new Remainiacs t-shirts, if you want to do a sub-branch of trade, just print that across on both sides. You're playing with decades-long agreements that underpin aspects of the economy nobody's even thought about. There was a story a couple of months ago where one of the Brexit planning departments, and as I understand it, 90% of UK citizens are currently working for a Brexit planning department, discovered that the pellets that UK exporters use, the wooden boxes that they use, weren't going to be compliant with EU law anymore, and nobody could ship anything. I mean, these are the kind of things where, like, I'm a trade expert. I'm paid to think about this stuff. It didn't occur to me. It occurred to others who work in that specialized area. It's literally like you've got the finest Swiss watch and you're just chucking rocks at its mechanism without knowing what's going to happen next. So the biggest thing to understand is, firstly, there are no easy answers to this. None of this stuff is magic. And as a general rule, the fundamental principle of trade, negotiations, integration is that you want to be integrating to make things together. That is why NAFTA exists. That is why the African Continental Free Trade Area exists. That is why Mercosur exists. Why the EU exists. If you think of the comparison I always use is, if you think about the economic strength of the US, why are they so powerful economically? There's a bunch of reasons, but one of them is that you can combine New York capital with California IT, with manufacturing in the Midwest, and you can pull all of those and you can create products that are able to draw on all of those sources of comparative advantage and compete globally in a way that, say, Wyoming by itself couldn't, or even California by itself would struggle to. That massive strength is an asset. The EU does that by merging, UK know-how with Portuguese know-how with German manufacturing techniques. Moving away from that runs directly contrary to everything we have learned about what you can do with trade policy to make countries more prosperous and to create better jobs. That is the fundamental issue. There is no getting around that fact.
That's brilliant. Thank you.
That was fantastic.
Yeah, that's
Dmitry for PM.
consummate. Yeah.
Of what?
Of the rubble.
The rubble.